Real Hi-Fi Help with part 2, bringing you the mastermind behind AudioNote, Peter Qvortrup. So let's dig into it.
And I never cease to be baffled at how little they actually know about how, what went before stereo. And also, interestingly, how little they know the discussions that took place when we went from the original Edison roll to the flat disc, to the 78, or what happened between when we went from the acoustic recordings to the electric recordings in the mid 1920s. And those discussions are actually are very important to understand how our view of what music is and how it should be reproduced, and what what is important in how music is viewed.
Totally agree.
As a
totally agree. Yeah.
sort of as a cultural artifact, if you can call it that.
Right.
No, I'm now gotten out of breath.
Okay. I just have a question which came up with regards to what you were talking about. So when you say processes which are influencing the sound, do you actually are you talking about something like with respect to the neutrality or something like that with respect of the sound? This question actually is posed by Arnold.
I think neutrality is a very loaded word, Karthik. I think the problem with the vocabulary that we use to describe audio and to describe sound, it is really misses the point. Accuracy, what the hell does that mean?
Accuracy, true.
Neutrality, what does that mean? Now, I prefer words like authenticity. I developed the sort of, you can call it the philosophical foundation of how I've evaluated whether a piece of equipment or a resistor or a capacitor or an entire system, how well it does its job. And it's on an article, on a piece that I wrote together with a friend of mine called Leonard Norwitz.
Yes.
In the early 90s, and it's called Are You on the Road to Audio Hell?
Yes.
Basically the idea there is quite simple, that we do not know what is on the recording, because at the end of the day, we don't know what was picked up by the microphones. I mean, we know what the piece of music is, we know who the artists are, but we cannot with any certainty say that the microphones did, or the rest of the equipment in the recording process did the job that we expected them to do. Therefore, from that, it follows that the only thing that we do know about recordings is that they must have a different sonic signature. Now, that sonic signature has little to do with the music. It has to do with the way the recording sounds. And so instead of using an evaluation system, which is by and large you could call comparison by reference. Now, what is comparison by reference? Comparison by reference is where you sit down with a number of known recordings and you then play those on an amplifier, pair of speakers, piece of cable, whatever. But the mere fact that you use these records as a reference means that you assume that you know what is on
it's supposed what's on the record.
And you can't possibly know that. I mean, you can know, there are a lot of things you can know. You can know the music, the artist, and so on. You can know that this recording is better than a lot of other recordings in the presentation. But what you cannot know is precisely how the recording sounds. And this is where comparison by contrast comes in. If you take, which is how we tend to develop these products, the products we make, and all the parts that we make and design, is by taking 5 or 10 random records, and then we listen to them to see whether a given piece of equipment or a circuit or a piece or a resistor or capacitor or whatever, whether that makes the recording sound more different, more individual from the other circuit, amplifier, speaker, whatever.
And that's a very interesting point that he makes there. That's also what I think when I think about audio note, is that all the recordings sound so different from each other compared to, let's just say, when I went back to my Macintosh. When I heard music through my Macintosh, it was through a certain type of filter where everything had a similar sound. Also, when I had my Vincent amplifier and Musical Fidelity and Audiolab and all of that gear, it was always a certain way of interpreting the music. And when you have audio note equipment, it's almost as if the differentiation, the difference between the instruments in the foreground and the background, and the different voices and the tonality of the strings and stuff like that, it almost as if it stands more out, it's fleshed more out, it's a bigger difference, there's more taste, there's more substance, and it's very interesting. I noticed that a lot with audio note when I went into audio note gear, and some good points he makes.
And that's actually quite easy to do once you've learned how to do it. But you have to upload a lot of this audiophile nonsense that is so enormously dominant.
DSP, DSD, stuff like that.
Most of which, of course, comes out of the United States, as
Yep.
so much other wonderful culture does. I would say no more.
It's also talking about electrostat speakers that they're so crazy about in the US. And electrostat speakers, they do a lot of cool, interesting stuff. But the problem is that you don't get the overall balanced entire spectrum of sound. You just get a very certain type of cool effect, and then you have to sit in a certain place in your room, and then it just takes you on like a track towards, that destination of cool sound that does a certain type of thing. So yeah, a lot of that stuff is mainly from the US.
And you have to get rid of that. You have to get rid of this idea
Less
that
is more.
Oh, I know what the violin sounds on this record, or I know what the piano sounds on this record. Mm-hmm. Or I listen more to where in the sound field the instruments are, in spite of the fact that you don't actually know where they are. Oh. The mere fact that you use more microphones actually creates a problem in the timing of how instruments sound together. There's a very famous test that I think it was Dick Olsher that did this test originally, but I'm not quite sure, where they took the latest re-release of Ella Fitzgerald, Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie. And they compared, I think it was the analog recordings, analog productions, with the original stereo. And then they compared it to the original mono. I have all three, so I can do exactly the same comparison. And it's very interesting when you listen to the timing, because it's quite a small band. It's like 4 pieces or 5 pieces in the band, and her voice. It's very interesting when you listen to the mono, that because you have the mono, you have the microphone in one place, all the sound from the different instruments arrive around about the same time. When you have several microphones on the stereo, you get a very, very subtle change in the timing in the way the instruments play together. And you can hear that. You have to have quite a good system to hear it, but you can hear that. So that then begs the question, why did we get stereo in the first place?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they knew this. I have early discussions from the technical department of EMI.
That is an interesting perspective on mono stereo thing. I mean, definitely to start with, stereo wasn't nearly as good as it is nowadays. They have improved that quite a bit. But I remember the first stereo recordings, they were actually not that good. So I think it has an effect of giving you a lot of information. That's good. That's really good. But the problem is that when you give more information and then you reduce the substance of that information, so you're basically getting just pure data. So you're getting speed, you're getting position, you're getting soundstage width, you're getting attack and all of that, but there's still no meat. There's no thing that really draws you in, that has a natural color, a natural sense of personality. A lot of microphones do somehow make the sound a bit sterile. And if you combine that problem with then taking the recording into the studio and then doing a lot of mixing and then using a lot of bad gear, a lot of bad cables, a lot of bad compressors, a lot of normalization and stuff like that, it does corrupt our sound. So he is right. There is a sort of uniqueness, a sense of raw, high quality sound from the past that is difficult to get close to. We are getting a hell of a lot more information because of all of these extra microphones and because a lot of them are in stereo. So the information and the layering and perhaps the depth and definitely the black level is a crazy amount better than it used to be. But it can be troublesome composing music and especially editing the music, so it still keeps its originality, because you also want to correct errors in the music, and correcting errors can actually destroy the music a lot. I've listened to a lot of high resolution soundtracks, especially 24 bits, 96 kilohertz, and a lot of it actually has a huge amount of problems because it does a lot of good, definitely. Some of those recordings are really phenomenal, but there are some small issues here and there, and I think Peter will cover that.
Where there was a lot of discussion about this, and this was one of the points that the recording engineers made at the time. So what they were saying was, what we really need are stick to mono, but just 2 speakers, 2 amplifiers, but they play mono. We just play mono. Now, I've done tests at shows over many, many years where I would play the mono version. I would have the stereo jacket for the record, but I have the mono version in it. And then I will play the mono version. I will put the stereo jacket up so that people can see what's playing. I have never had a single complaint that they didn't sound like stereo.
Peter, I have a question from a gentleman, Mazban. Can you unmute yourself and ask the question? In fact, it's a series of questions which are all related. So, Mazban, if I can request you to unmute yourself and pose the question to Peter directly.
Can you hear me, guys? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
You're very audible, Mazban. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Peter, the thing is that, you were talking about people changing capacitors and resistors and trying to make kind of understand or hear the difference of these components make, because we really don't know what's on the recording. So what is the reference material that one needs to balance or bias all? I mean,
that does not have a simple answer.
No, because what I'm trying to say is this all would also depend on the person, on the ears of the person who's making those changes, right? So what's good for the goose may not be good for the gander. Like you might say, okay, this brand fancy new capacitor makes the sound so good, but to me it must be sounding like crap. Maybe there's a problem in your hearing, and that's why you change that capacitor. So shouldn't there be some kind of measurable metric, is what I'm saying? Like, shouldn't there be a frequency response plot, or maybe a phase response plot, maybe an ETC or an impulse response, which actually tells us, look, this going through this capacitor is so clean, or it is so dirty, or it has got this kind of roll off or not. And based on that, we should make decisions, not on because it sounds good or it's got some air or it is, all these fancy words that audiophiles use to describe.
But that's part of the problem. And this is why if you study the comparison by contrast method in more detail, one of the things you'll realize, especially if you hear a system that's good at presenting the contrast, it becomes pretty obvious what it is you should be listening for. And I mean, I've tested this on dozens and dozens and dozens of people over the years. And I would say what is very interesting is that I would say that most of the people that respond well to this do not carry too much audiophile baggage. i.e., they're listening for parameters that they know. They have this expectation of imaging or sound staging or whatever it is. Now, I have a record. I'll see if I can find it there. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
This record is one of the more interesting recordings to own. In fact, I just got the CD in. It literally arrived as we speak.
Okay.
What is interesting about this record is that it is clearly described in the text on the back where in the sound field the instruments are, how far back they are, and so. And this allows you a much better, all things being equal, allows you a much better way, or a very effective way, should I perhaps say, of judging what your system's actually doing. Because it's quite easy to make for example, a loudspeaker that presents imaging in a certain way on a multi-mic recording. All you have to do is have a slight raise in the energy band from somewhere between 2 and 5 kilohertz. That's where a lot of this information sits. So if you have a frequency response that looks like this, and that sits in that area where this particular information is dominant, then you get better imaging and sound staging.
That's an interesting
perspective. But at the
perspective.
end of the day, all of this is packaging of the sound. It is not the sound itself. And that's where I think the industry has completely and utterly lost its way.
Yeah, I agree.
That it's incapable of, what should we say, prioritizing what is it that matters.
I think it's a very good point from Peter, you especially notice this from with headphones, and they constantly rave, all these reviewers, about this hertz and that hertz on the graph, and they want to show you like, ooh, it's very neutral, ooh, it has this dip here and there. And just like Peter says, you can provoke certain types of effects by adjusting that frequency area, so it might, a bit more, have a bit more dominance in certain areas, like for example 5 kilohertz area. And that's also what I hear when I hear a lot of equipment, that they are all very similarly built, but it's almost as if there's just like a small tipping on the scale, so certain frequencies get more attention than others. I hear that with a lot of transistor gear, especially stuff like AudioFlight, Class C, Macintosh, Krell, and stuff like that. It's almost as if you took the same gear and then you just like did something with the frequency spectrum, just like gave it a little twist here and there, right? And then you get like a very unique in-house sound, and then you just kind of build the designs around this without really using proper components, because you've got all these cheap filters kind of locking the sound. So yeah, interesting.
When you speak to musicians, I have a number of quite well-known musicians on my client list, many of whom or several of whom have become friends over the years. When you sit and talk to them, a lot of them have started out going, yes, but all this matters. And then you play them systems, and then you start playing them old recordings from 78, particularly recordings from the acoustic era. Now, what's special about those recordings? Well, the most special aspect of them is that the what should we say, that the distance between the man singing into the horn and the membrane with the pin that cuts the sound into the lacquer is very, very short. So the distance between the actual event and putting it down to document is very, very short. And yes, there are issues with distortion and all kinds of other things, but there is an authenticity to recordings that are done this way. When you listen to, and I don't know whether any of you do, when you listen to people like Caruso, or you listen to some of the great Martinelli, or any of the other great singers from that period, they were all recorded this way. They were not recorded with using any kind of electronics. It was purely mechanical and acoustic. And there is something about those recordings. They capture something that nothing we've done since captures. And that then begs the question, what is that? Why are we not, with all our fancy technology and our digital this and blah, blah, blah that, and our wideband microphones and all this sort of crap, why are we not catching this? Why are we not able
Wideband
to capture
microphones.
that?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
It is in the sort of phrasing and the sort of emotional content, if you will, from these recordings. We don't pick that up with modern equipment.
That is interesting.
But nobody, I've spent lots of times in studios because I amongst a lot of the craziness I do, I act as acoustic advisor to a very famous conductor, friend of mine. So I've spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours at recording venues, listening to the downplay, backplay from the recordings, listening to the individual microphones and all sorts of things like that. And the conclusion I come to is that we're really not doing a very good job here. You know, and this is in spite of the fact that his readings of the particular pieces of music that we're recording are actually quite phenomenal by any standard, historical or otherwise. But it's just that the document we're creating does not reflect that.
Right.
Does that make sense? Right, I can see that 100 million. Jesus, my glasses are not designed to read off the screen, so I'm going to have to sit and look at the screen. I mean, the question of subjectivity, I mean, to my mind, the subjective element is what kind of music you prefer, not what the sound should be.
Okay.
I see, you know, if you get music that you really like and the recording is really bad, I'll still listen to it. You know, I listen to music that goes back to the 1890s. And
Wow.
I can tell you one thing, it's not a great sound, but the performance is definitely worth listening to. You know, being able to listen to Edward Grieg play his own Papillon in 1903, shortly before he died, that is a form of time travel.
All right.
That's the only form of time travel that any of us will ever do. It's the same listening to Shalyapin sing The River Maiden or, you know, whatever. That is what's so special about these old recordings, is that we can delve back into and listen to people that have gone many, many years ago, you know. And it's the same with, you know, listening to you know, David Saperton plays the Gudowski.
But yeah, I also have to kind of elaborate on that. I did not realize how many old recordings were so good before I had Audio Note. When I was stuck with my other gear, I never really listened to James Taylor, Dolly Parton, all of these, you know, folk singer type of people, because it was just old and boring, limited, bright, grey, uninteresting. And there's a sort of, yeah, it's like a nostalgic type of reinventing the sound when you listen to something like Audio Note. It just takes you back, almost like using a time machine of some sort. It just connects such a deep way that just like Peter says, there are so many old recordings and recordings that many people don't listen to, where they think, oh, this isn't good, oh, nah. And it's a pity. The really good recordings that I've noticed are stuff like Led Zeppelin, even though it was recorded in a very harsh way with probably mono microphones and such, just has some kind of a raw, authentic type of sound. And then when you listen to the newer remastered versions of Led Zeppelin, then you just think, God, they almost ruined it totally. How can it sound so bad? It's supposed to be better. It's remastered. But yeah, there is something about originality and not going too many steps ahead where you can't fully control the technology. I also want to kind of elaborate on the whole microphone thing. The whole frequency spectrum is a bit controversial with having these extended frequency microphones. I feel personally, also having looked at some PS Audio videos, that there is some truth to using extended frequencies on equipment that you can't necessarily hear, because it affects it on a linear level, meaning that all the stuff that you're not supposed to be able to hear, stuff that goes up to 100 kilohertz and down to, let's just say, 5 or 10 hertz, you're not really able to listen to that. But, and here's a big but, it has a linear effect, a linear pull, the stuff you can hear on the stuff that you can't hear, and vice versa. So they are somehow related to each other, and there is a lot of a really good sound to be had there, that I think that AudioNote haven't fully gotten into. I don't feel that it's behind the other brands that do use this technology, but I haven't looked at this new field coil technology that he's about to reveal, but I have a feeling that AudioNote are going to do something pretty big in regards to getting back to this old Western Electric sound, perhaps introducing a whole new line of speakers. So that's going to be interesting. I think he's probably going to say that a bit later.
Transcriptions of the Chopin etudes, or listening to King Oliver play, what's it called? Louis Armstrong did the best version of this, the girl that's lying dead in hospital. I can't remember what the bloody the name of the recording is, or the song is. And, these things they have a value that goes far beyond this audiophile bullshit, to be perfectly frank with you. And I see my job is really to make my audience, if you can call my customers my audience, understand the value of this by producing equipment that allows them to access it in such a way that they get the core musical message rather than just the noise from the 78. And the audiophile equipment will give you the noise, which is why people don't listen to recordings like this.
Interesting.
So, have I been rude enough to everyone yet?
But there is a lot of truth to that, because a lot of simple old records, tracks or whatever you call them, can't really be listened to on a lot of top systems, because they just somehow zoom in too much on the noise, and somehow AudioNote has figured out how to zoom in on that, those qualities of the sound. So I would say that he's totally right about that.
I got that a lot. Well, I can see there's a question here from Avinash. But this is what's so interesting. You see, if you read the early discussions, and particularly, I've only got the ones from EMI, but I know from a friend of mine who worked for Decca. He's passed away a few years ago, but I know from him that there were similar discussions within Decca in the UK, that really, when you have a sound field that's filled in properly, it's actually very difficult to hear the difference between stereo and mono. If you listen to really early early stereo recordings, you can take the Sonny Rollins Way Out West. On the original stereo version of that, you have the saxophone on the left and the drums and the bass on the right. That is stereo. Because they've just, Electric Recording Company has just re-released probably the finest re-releases ever done of Way Out West. And they purposely released both the original tapes in stereo, and they re-released them in mono. And these were done by different microphones.
That is interesting.
Simultaneously.
I'd like to hear that.
The stereo is irritating to listen to because of the way it's recorded. The mono is much preferable. So I think, again, history is important here. It's important to understand history. You know, I study economic history as well. And we're very good at forgetting things that don't fit our particular set of biases, for example.
No,
that's very common.
Yeah,
in fact, I would say it's more common than not. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from history. In fact, we'd probably be better off studying a bit more history and a bit less technology.
Yes.
And to understand why things are that ended up the way they did. You know, once they started being able to record with multiple microphones, as we went through the 1960s, you can clearly hear a gradual, very, very gradual degradation of the quality of the source material.
That is interesting. I haven't really noticed that.
And it's, you know, I mean, this is one of my main interests in life, and I also happen to make it my living. So, you know, it sort of, it mixes itself very nicely there. I'll try and read one of the other questions.
It's like a mad scientist, Peter Qvortrup.
Okay, well, Arnaud's got this down to a fine art with his question, so it's a question that answers itself in a way. Atle, how about new recordings? Pre-80s recordings are the only ones worth spending time on. No, I wouldn't agree. I mean, I listen to a lot of. I mean, last night I sat and I listened to both Tool's albums, the last two albums, 10,000 Days and that other one that's got this weird name that I can't figure out.
There are limitations of what I want to listen to.
Which is the most expensive CD ever sold. You know, $120 for a CD. That's and considering that he knocked Taylor Swift off the album chart in 2 days with sales of a CD that's $120. I find that quite amusing, actually. But then James Maynard Keenan is quite an extraordinary man. But it's.
Obviously, there are limitations to what I can listen to. There are few limitations. I would never listen to Tool, Slipknot, or Behemoth. For me, it's just horrible music. That it's just my opinion. If other people want to listen to it, it's fine. But yeah, you would think that a guy in his 70s would not listen to stuff like Tool and Slipknot and opera and all kinds of weird stuff. So yeah, he is truly a mad scientist, Peter Qvortrup.
I mean, I listen to all sorts of things. My Iranian distributor was kind enough to send me a huge amount of CDs with Iranian music, which I find
makes some good music, Iranian music,
very, very good.
Pakistani
a lot of
music,
that,
really
and
good.
a lot of that goes back to the
really good.
To the 1920s.
We should listen to more of that in the West. We should.
You know, or to pre the current regime, like Kurush. And I just find all of this, I find it very stimulating, and I find it very interesting, and it also helps me. I think, take a much broader perspective on what it is we're supposed to do. So, yeah, what can you say?
I have one point in continuation to what you're talking about, Peter. Like, you have been a very vocal critic of what we call as trendy and modern solutions to imaginary problems, or what you describe as a numbers game.
Well, the numbers game is again, it's again this. We have there is a tendency in modern culture, and I mean this is really Western culture adopted by India and China and Indonesia, and because you actually, if you look at your culture, it's a much more complex than what we present in the West, and a lot of this is. Again, it's part of this mass marketing. If you study mass marketing, and of course, we started with Edward Bernays in around the First World War. What you'll understand is that the more simple you can make the message, the more effective the message is.
That is true, and that's also a big trap. Because everything that's popular is popular because it's very simplified and because it's based on specifications and being convenient, having a lot of features and stuff like that. This totally clashes with having the most optimal, best ever sound. You cannot have a lot of features, a lot of stuff that your gear does, and then get close to the top potential of sound that exists. It just does not work. It's kind of an either or a sort of a compromise where you're lowering down on probably both parts.
And in no area is this more common than with the numbers game. And the numbers game really doesn't matter. I mean, it started with low distortion in the late 1940s with the Williamson
1940s,
amplifier.
wow.
It had 0.1% distortion. And all Williamson really did was apply more feedback successfully without destabilizing the circuit to an EL34 amplifier. And from there on, it then became, David Hafler came in with his 0.01. And then it's become, now we have so many zeros, you can't find the one at the end. And it's a nonsense because the way we achieve it is by trickery. The underlying problems in these circuits.
That is true. That is true.
Still there, and they're still audible.
Also, just to kind of create a parallel to this world here, we have the same thing going on in the PC world, where we have Nvidia and AMD fighting against each other on the graphics market, and they're both showing off their tests, like we can do this, and then the other company says we can do that, but they never really show exactly what the test conditions are, like AMD, for example, did at this latest reveal of their CPUs, where they just quickly showed you a glimpse of their GPUs, their graphics cards, and it kind of destroys the argument of measuring stuff, because every time stuff is measured, it's always measured out of context. So that's how you win an argument in measuring stuff. You just take, like, here, we can do this, boom, 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 lower distortion. But if you measure it under other conditions, and if you at the same time manipulate the data so it looks artificially good, you can't use distortion numbers. Distortion numbers are in some way a thing that you can use to some degree, but it will only give you a small part of the truth of what's actually going on in the sound.
And I mean, as far as digital is concerned, I'll tell you a little anecdote. In 1992, I went to Japan with two journalists. One, because I wanted to publicize the collaboration we had with AudioNote, and two, because I wanted them to write a little bit about the very different market there was for specialist audio in Japan compared to the West. Now, Sony found out that we were there. So they invited us to visit their R&D lab. And one afternoon we went there and walked around their lab, and we saw part of the factory, or one of the factories. They have several. And at the end of it, it was all very impressive. I mean, I would have hired most of the engineers that I met there in a heartbeat. They were fascinating. They really were, you know. They had that sort of historic perspective, and they understood, you know, here were kids that were in their late 20s. Oh, I say kids, I'm 70 now, that's why I can say that. Otherwise it would be offensive. No, but there were young people that had literally had maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years out of university. And they had a really good grasp of what went before, which was very interesting, because you don't get that out of the Western colleges or universities.
That is interesting.
You get a kids have, you know, they can only look back about as far as it took them to get the education, and they don't really look back any further. But anyway, so at the end of it, we were invited to they had a bar downstairs where people would go and relax before they went home from work. And I'm thinking of doing that here because, but of course, if you have too much to drink, you can't drive home. Of course, in Japan, if you take the train, that has some benefits if you had a few too many. Anyway, but they had invited in the old engineer who had developed the 16-bit system. And we had a very interesting conversation. He was charming. And we had a very interesting conversation with him. And so we said to him, so, I can't remember his name now, but let's say he was called Mr. Morikawa. Mr. Morikawa, so what do you listen to at home? I listen to classical music. Oh, that's very nice. So do I. Do you listen to CD or LP? And he sort of looked at us and he went, I listen LP. And in fact, he said, I listen only mono.
Okay.
So we said to him, okay, well, that's really interesting. So why not CD? And he leaned over the table and he said, LP for music, CD for commercial.
Wonderful.
And then I asked him, so how did you end up at the 16-bit system? Why 16-bit? And he said, 16-bit is the mathematical equilibrium between bandwidth, distortion, and noise.
That is interesting.
He said, you go up, you improve bandwidth, but you make the noise and dynamics worse. You go down, you reduce bandwidth, but you get better dynamics and less noise.
That is interesting, because for a lot of people, they consider that actually the opposite. So if you go up from 16-bit to 24-bit, it has the illusion of actually being less noisy, when in fact it really is more noisy. And at the same time, like he said, like Peter said, when you go from 16 to 24 bits, problems arise with dynamics, because you have a chip that has to process data. when you put such a huge load on that chip, yes, it will seem as if there is more information. There probably is more information, but at the expense of the dynamics, meaning that it seems more lush, more warm, more controlled, more nice. But the whole flow of the music, it's like it's congestion, and and you're taking this pipe and you're just completely filling it up, so that the stream of water or whatever goes through that pipe just can't go as fast through that pipe as it wants to. And that is why a lot of older recordings that are 16 bits actually sound better than the more informative 24-bit 96 kilohertz. Sadly, it is like that. But the problem is also that you need a system to fully give you the idea of what the hell is going on. And so many systems are so bad in sound quality that the worst option sometimes seems a lot better, and sometimes you're struggling to find out, okay, is it 16 or 24-bit? What is better? And you can hear there's a difference, but you can't really register what exactly is going on. And it takes a pretty good system to reveal this, to make you go, oh, damn, I didn't realize that. When I stream on my computer, on my PC streamer, I can, in my program JRiver, I can run it on auto, so it runs it 100% to the natural sound setting that the song is delivered in, or I can downscale it to 16-bit 44 kilohertz. 16-bit 44 kilohertz is going to sound more down to earth, simple, harsh, and raw, and is dependent on really, really high quality gear in order for that to sound good. And that is why it's not popular listening to 16-bit 44K music. It requires so much quality of component. It requires so much consistency throughout all the levels that most people don't even bother listening to it. And it's a very annoying thing. But as I was getting to, the program that I have on my PC, JRiver, that plays all my music, I can set it if I want to play it in, for example, 24-bit 96 kilohertz. And having listened to 16-bit 44 kilohertz for a while, it will start to sound a lot better listening to 24-bit 96 kilohertz. But after a while, you kind of notice that you lose the interest in listening to music, because it doesn't become truly harmonical and balanced. It just sort of loses its appeal, and it just feels somehow tainted. Yeah, okay, next song. Yeah, it's a pretty cool bass here, and then next song. And you don't get that with 16-bit 44 kilohertz. When you listen to that on some really good equipment, you just want to sit glued to your chair, not changing the record, not changing the CD, just letting it run from start to end, because it just has that fantastic flow that just keeps you pulled in and interested and just going like, what the hell is this, Sounds pretty good. Yeah.
Now, if you look at what happens when you increase the sound, what you do is you're shortening the word length. What nobody looks at,
I don't know what that means.
When you shorten the word length, you basically, when you have a 1 and then you have a 0, what happens is that you get a lot of noise at the top of each.
Okay.
And then we have all sorts of clever ways of trying to get rid of that. The fact of the matter is that you can't remove it. There are no systems that we are able to develop that work real time.
Yeah.
They always they're always reactive.
That is
They're
interesting.
like a servo. So they react to something that's already happened. Because in order to work real time, you would need to be able to predict what the signal is, the next signal is doing.
Mm-hmm.
There exists no technology that I know of that is capable of doing that. Which means that all the feedback systems and amplifiers that people use to get their great low distortion figures or high damping factor figures or whatever it is, and all the noise that's made about 24-bit and 32-bit and 384 or whatever it is kilohertz sampling rate, it's all bullshit, basically, because you cannot change the fundamentals of the signal. The way they achieve these numbers is by trickery, and
Peter, I'm sorry, please go on.
no, so basically what the Japanese engineer told us, we can prove that to be true. We can it's quite easy to demonstrate that the 16-bit 44 kilohertz, that's as good as digital will ever get.
That is interesting.
And what you have to do is spend an inordinate amount of time and money on trying to, what should we say, show how much information is actually on these systems
Yeah.
that are so antiquated now by modern technological standards.
That is an interesting argument. I mean, if it was possible, it would also be interesting to listen to 64 bits, for example, music, if that was at all possible. But as far as I know, the chip limitation on our systems is on, I think, 20 or 21 bits. So I don't see us ever getting up to around 64 bits quality sound, real 64 bits. So he could be right that all of this advanced mathematical stuff that we're doing, this trickery, is somehow not really dealing with the problem itself. It's actually causing other problems to happen. So it is a very interesting argument from Peter.
I'll just go to one question, which is from Masban once again.
And yeah, it is. I haven't heard anything getting close to the AudioNote CD4 and the other one above that. I can't remember what they're called, but the top CD players from AudioNote, I haven't heard anything getting close to that. I heard a lot of interesting CD players. What was it? Macintosh was kind of interesting. The MCD 1100, it did impress me at some point. And then the Meitner one, yeah, not quite as good. MLabs, quite a bit better. And Playback Design, I'm not sure if Playback Design actually made a CD. I think it was a DAC instead. I think, I think Playback Design also made one that was also really impressive. But compared to the AudioNote one, it just wasn't nearly as human, as authentic, and being able to play, old regular CDs. All of these advanced CD players that are really expensive, you almost have to have HD CD or SACD or some kind of special format for it to sound pretty good. And even when you have that and used a fortune on that, doesn't quite integrate and sound natural. It somehow sticks out, and it just feels manipulated in sound. And then you end up, I don't know, paying $50,000 or something like that for a really good CD player, and then it doesn't take more than a couple of years, and then you're already tired of that sound, and then you want to go over to maybe a Negra CD player that is a bit cheaper and perhaps better, but they, compared to audio note, they still sound a bit analytical and sterile in sound. They do a lot of really impressive stuff. I would say Negra makes, for sure, one of the top 10 CD players on the market, together with I think Spectral and Playback Design and M Labs. They all make some pretty good CD players, but still, even though they're top 10 on the list, I mean, they don't get anywhere close to a Audio Note CD3 that's running optimally on an Audio Note system. Like yeah, you could take that CD3 and put it on a Negra system or whatever, and it wouldn't sound as good, because Negra needs Negra CD, Audio Note needs Audio Note CD. It just has to, you have to get that same language in order for it to sound really good. I remember listening to, what was it, Negra CD player on a Macintosh system. Absolutely horrible. Let me just continue this on video number 3.